Okay, let me eventually start saying that you gave a very extreme example with COVID and surveillance in China, and at the same time you were asking me whether what Microsoft is doing to implement ethical AI. So we're at two extremes here in the discussions. I'll start with how we implement ethical AI, and then I will talk a little bit about surveillance risks. So first of all, think very similar to what the high-level group on AI did in last year that was commissioned by the European Commission. Microsoft has, as many other companies, developed ethical principles that since around 2 years or more we have been operationalizing. That is this operationalization is starting with really thinking through a governance model that can actually help us do so at large scale. We have we started with our engineering groups, those who develop AI, the Ether committee, thinking about how to engineer in an ethical way AI applications. And since then, we have built out a governance model that includes a responsible AI chief officer, a responsible AI office, and a scalable system that now requires all our engineering groups to really implement and operationalize a standard that we have developed in order to do so. Now, this is at the developing side. And then it becomes a question of how these technologies are deployed. And this goes to what is the framework we need to deploy the technology ethically. As you may know, Arnaud, we have been advocating for regulation, in particular in areas where we see risks to fundamental rights. And we have picked one specific example, which is facial recognition. I'd say the European Union's human rights framework and fundamental rights framework is a bulwark, is a protection against types of surveillance risks, but it requires also secondary law to implement those in the right way. In a way, we have already been working in other regions of the world, and there is really good examples in how you can actually legislate to make AI, not only in the development side, but also in the deployment side, accountable and transparent. So one good example in particular when it comes to facial recognition is a Washington state law that has been implemented last year that really gives the ingredients in how you can think through the mechanisms that are required in order for allowing citizens to trust in the technology. This requires documentation, it requires stakeholder engagement, it requires transparency and accountability. It's really important that people know beforehand what's happening and have afterwards the ability to seek for verifications.
And Cornelia, according to you, how should the public sector the public sector makes good usage of facial recognition to avoid problems of privacy and human rights. According to you, what route should we be thinking of?
Where these rights, where human rights are at risk, there is a positive obligation to ensure that Microsoft has, that lawmakers have to implement that ensure rights safeguards. There's really good case law at European level, at the Human Rights Court, that really provide the framework how we should think about this. The Maluna case of the European Rights Court, for example, suggested that it is required that measures that might infringe human rights have to be proportionate, they have to be necessary, and they need to include specific safeguards in order to protect the specific human rights in place. And in the context of facial recognition, I think that is where a lot of debate is currently happening. The white paper of the European Commission has put that forward. The Commission has also put that forward, in particular when used in public spaces, as a request for an open debate.
Yeah, and how do you manage those values in your model, and how can you provide concrete example on how does Microsoft mitigates transparency and inclusion?
Okay, so first of all, the governance model that I spoke about with very concrete responsibilities that go up to our senior leadership level, also are developing now tools and practices in order to look at the very beginning of an AI application already. What is it for? How it should implement it, but what are the potential risks and how can they be mitigated? We also have started to develop a review of cases and customer requests where that we call sensitive uses, so that when we are unsure whether these ethical principles to which we have committed can be assured, that we have a possibility to review these cases. Some of those really develop around potential risks to fundamental rights, others to harm and safety issues, and others really to eventually more mundane issues around the denial of consequential services such as finance, for example.
Yeah. And we heard that in the previous session, the AI regulation should be considered as a path and not as an end game. Can you tell us how it is impacting the ecosystem in Europe, and how do you foresee the lawmaking process?
Yeah, that's a crystal ball question, of course. Look, first of all, I'm of the opinion that this is a path. The AI regulation that we will see in March by the European Commission is a horizontal approach. At the same time, we will have to use it. You really think about risk scenarios. And there's also a lot of existing laws in place that apply, of course, to AI, such as GDPR, privacy protection, non-discrimination, sectoral rules that are specifically attuned to liability or risks for safety. And we will have to see how all of these laws will interact with the AI regulation that is coming. At the same time, it's not only about the laws that are in place. I think it's also about how these laws will be interpreted, because there is other ways to think through this. And there is a lot of research currently still done in order to advance that thinking. So lawmakers and really companies in particular should focus on the things, the high risks that we already see, and learn from these scenarios to develop further mechanisms to have a really robust governance models from the development to the deployment of the AI. Okay.
Well, maybe one last question, and very shortly, because we are running out of time, but technology should be at the service of the society, and we can face several challenges like ethical responsibility, data transparency, or accountability. How does Microsoft envisage to answer to those challenges?
So again, I think the standards that we are currently developing, and they are evolving as we speak. There's a lot of learning to do. We also think they need to be supplemented for certain risks by regulation, but we also try to, as we learn around those technologies and around these standards, to provide those to our customers to help them implement responsible AI as they deploy the technologies.
All right, Cornelia, I think we are reaching the end of this session. Coffee break is ending now. I'd like to thank you for sharing your views and also for trusting EU Tracker to support your activities in Europe. We can give the end to Ellen again.
Thank you very much, and it's an important part of how we look at legislation as well.
Thank you all.